Federal Flaws, Perceiving the Problem, Segment 8, Decapitated Government. In the 1870s, the fundamental government of the United States of America was decapitated. The president of the original government and the cabinet of that government ceased to exist. By 1873, the Congress of the original government failed to have a quorum in the House of Representatives. What replaced the original government of the United States was a mix of the bureaucracy of the original government and the elected offices of the undergovernment, with the bureaucracy of the original government being superior in authority. The only way to tell the difference between the two governments was based on the capitalization used in their acts of government. This decapitation was a three-part plan taking decades to implement. The first step was to create a secret government. If the people don't know the secret government exists, then they can't directly influence or control that government. In the previous segments of Federal Flaws, Perceiving the Problem, we've seen how the Undergovernment Constitution, published in 1796 and modified in 1815, created a secret government. The next step was to make that government self-appointing in the tradition of the philosopher kings of Plato. The final step was to decapitate the original government by seating the members of the original government Congress and the original government president in the undergovernment instead of the original government. In the previous segments of this video series, we have seen how capitonyms were used to give authority to the undergovernment constitution when the original government allowed the undergovernment to have a seat of government in Washington, D.C. To decapitate and seize control over the Republican form of government found in the original Constitution requires capturing three branches of government. The dual constitutions made the judicial branch the easiest to capture. From its earliest days, the Supreme Court appears to have been an undergovernment Supreme Court, not the one Supreme Court of the original Constitution. In Statutes at Large, Volume 12, page 319, we find an original government act called an Act to Confiscate Property Used for Insurrectionary Purposes. This law gave the President the power to suspend undergovernment laws, spelled with an uncapitalized L. Since the undergovernment Constitution refers to itself as the supreme law of the land, it can be suspended under this act. When you hear about the President suspending the Constitution, it is the undergovernment Constitution that is being suspended. The power to suspend the judicial branch is the power to control it. Of course, in a Republican form of government, the exercise of power from multiple branches of government by one person at one time is defined as tyranny by the Founding Fathers. It appears that this concept escapes even politicians of today. Capturing the executive branch is fairly easy. For example, the act that created the Treasury of the United States of the original government is found in Statutes at Large, Volume 1, page 65. The Secretary of the Treasury is to be appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. But Section 1 of that act defines an assistant to the Secretary to be appointed by the Secretary of the Treasury. Section 7 of this act states when there is a vacancy in the office of the Secretary of the Treasury, the assistant shall have charge and custody of the records, books, and papers appertaining to that office. This means that the assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury can act as the Secretary of the Treasury, even naming a successor to the office of assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury. The Secretary of the Treasury acts with a power delegated from the President, and unless contradicted by the President, is for all practical purposes the President of the United States. This is how a self-appointing bureaucracy can function without a president or cabinet members. Capturing the legislature is much harder than capturing the executive and judicial branches. The members of the legislature are accountable to the people and are distributed widely throughout the nation. On February 21, 1871, the original government passed an act to provide a government for the District of Columbia. Section 5 of that act gave the government of the District of Columbia legislative power and authority in said district. Not of the district, but in it. The government of the District of Columbia had the same power as the undergovernment Congress, and since the undergovernment Congress had the same legislative power as the original government Congress, there were now three governments in Washington that had the power of the original government's Congress. The officers of this government were appointed by the President, except 22 legislators who had to live in the District of Columbia. But this restriction was only really binding at first, because this government had the legislative power of Congress and could change these provisions as needed. On June 20th, 1874, after the original government had been decapitated, the undergovernment passed an Act for the Government of the District of Columbia and for other purposes, found in Statutes at Large, Volume 18, Part 3, page 116. Section 1 of that Act states that all provisions of law providing for the existing government of the District of Columbia be repealed. That was law spelled with an uncapitalized L. Since the Act of 1871 was spelled with a capital A, it was a law of the original government, spelled with a capital L, not a law of the undergovernment, spelled with an uncapitalized L. So theoretically, here was a way to capture a republican form of government. All it required was decapitating the original government of the United States by getting rid of the original government president and the original government Congress. The problems with the ratification of the 14th Amendment will be discussed later. But even assuming that the 14th Amendment was properly added to the original Constitution for the United States of America, it doesn't work for people born in the several states because of the 10th Amendment. To be born as a 14th Amendment citizen requires being born within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. The United States doesn't have the general jurisdiction necessary for that to happen within the several states. The spelling of the word citizen with an uncapitalized C demonstrates this class of citizen was meant for the undergovernment Constitution. After apparent ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, the undergovernment of the United States was busy supervising elections throughout the Union. These elections were clearly for the undergovernment, so by Grant's second term, he was running for the position of undergovernment president. Attached to the Appropriations Bill of May 8, 1872, is an act of the original government describing the expansion of grounds of the Capitol. It effectively forces the sale of the building to the undergovernment. May 4, 1873 was the inauguration of the president. This is the invitation from the Senate Journal. The invitation is sent to the original government Senate, but the invitation is only for those who are, at that time, entitled to act as members of the Senate. Since the undergovernment literally has title to the Capitol, no one in the Senate fits that description. Also notice that the name U.S. Grant is in all uppercase letters without capitalization. The name Hamilton Fish is capitalized and under the phrase, by the President. It was very common for Fish to sign letters like this sent by Grant. This extraordinary occasion, as the invitation puts it, is so special that it requires a new record of Congress, and this inauguration event is the first thing to be recorded in the Congressional Record. Grant is coming into this inauguration as the President of the original government and the President-elect of the undergovernment. If Grant is not to continue being the original government president, then the next person in line would be the sitting vice president elected in 1868 or the vice president elected in 1872. The sitting vice president was Schuyler Colfax, who was dropped from the ticket in 1872 because of his association with the Credit Mobilier scandal. Henry Wilson ran as Grant's vice president in 1872. The Congressional Record indicates that Vice President Henry Wilson had taken the office before the day of the inauguration, so no one expected Colfax to be the vice president anymore. The office of vice president, associated with the name Henry Wilson, was also in uppercase letters, indicating an undergovernment office. The name Henry Wilson was also in all uppercase letters. The next two persons in line for the presidency would be the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate. The House had adjourned the day before, and the Congressional Record refers to those members in the House of Representatives present as ex-members of the House of Representatives and members-elect of the 43rd Congress. There was no Speaker of the House. Before 1890, the Senate only selected a President pro tempore of the Senate when the Vice President was expected to be absent. On January 24, 1873, Henry B. Anthony was President pro tempore of the Senate. There wasn't another President pro tempore until March 12th, when Matthew H. Carpenter filled the position. The person next in line for the presidency of the original government was Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State, who was already apparently signing by the President over his name. After 4 years, all of Grant's cabinet except Fish had left and Henry Wilson had died in office. By 1877, there was no one left to ascend to the presidency of the original government of the United States of America. The government had been decapitated. It is fitting that it is possible that the last person to hold the office of President of the original government was named in honor of Alexander Hamilton, the champion of aristocracy. If anyone had known what had happened, the President pro tempore of the Senate could have resigned to become Vice President and ascend to the presidency. This option quickly evaporated because new senators who are elected by state legislatures are required to be sworn in by the Vice President of the original government. The Oath of Office Act was the very first act passed by Congress. With no Vice President, newly elected senators could not be seated in the original government. Up until the middle of the 20th century, if anyone had known what had happened, the chief executives of the several states of the Union could have made appointments in the recesses of their legislature and formed a quorum for the Senate to pick a President pro tempore. In 1913, with the 17th Amendment to the Undergovernment Constitution, the legislatures of the states were no longer picking the senators, and the senators ceased to be officers of the original government of the United States of America. In the middle of the 20th century, the states formed corporate shell states, decapitating the state governments just like the original government of the United States of America had been decapitated. Unseating the original jurisdiction governors seemed to be making taking back control of our union impossible, but there are people who claim to have filled some of those positions. The validity of those claims have yet to be proven, but that is irrelevant. This video series, Federal Flaws Perceiving the Problem, was designed to work in tandem with a peaceful petition called the Petition for American Justice. This petition is intended to be used to fix our federal flaws and provide a pardon for those government workers who are caught in the position of continuing to support a treasonable government or fleeing and leaving us in anarchy and chaos. If the petition process cannot succeed in seating our lawful government and restoring the rule of law before the 40-day time limit following the exhaustion of remedies in courts of law, then it will be our duty to invoke the right of revolution. If you want peace, now is the time to act.